Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Turvey. I'm President and Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's J-Talks live discussion about games and journalism, an editorial strategy that's proving to be a winning approach for news organizations and their audiences. Our thanks to TD Bank Group, our exclusive J-Talks series sponsor, for making these conversations possible, and our gratitude also extends to our in-kind supporter, Cision, and to CPAC, our broadcast partner for these events. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Toronto, which is situated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We're privileged to work and gather in these territories. The discussion today will run for an hour, and please feel free to jump in with questions at any time using the tab on your screen. If you're interested in more conversations like this, join us later this month for Tactics for Combating News Avoidance. We'll bring together journalists and researchers across generations to explore practical ways to help audiences stay engaged with the news in challenging times when the instinct can be to tune out. Whether it's testing your knowledge with a daily news quiz or diving into interactive data visualizations, games and gamification have become powerful tools for newsrooms. This evolution from the traditional crossword puzzle is transforming how audiences engage with news in the digital age. Just look at the New York Times Games app, which now engages more users than its news app. That raises some big questions we'll explore today. Are the game players becoming news readers? Should newsrooms integrate games into their content? And if you're not the New York Times, what role can games play in your editorial strategy? I'm excited to introduce you to three leaders who are shaping how games and journalism intersect. Joining us from the Bay Area in California, Jonathan Knight is the General Manager of Games for the New York Times, where he operates and empowers the team that brings daily joy to puzzle solvers. In Atlanta, David Clinch is co-founder and Managing Director at Media Growth Partners, where he works at the intersection of news and digital technology, helping news organizations survive and thrive. And in Washington, D.C., Amy Parlapiano is a quiz writer and newsletter editor for the Washington Post, where she pioneered the Post's daily news quiz. Putting the pieces of this puzzle together, our guest moderator, Piya Chattopadhyay, comes to us from Toronto, where she's the host of CBC's The Sunday Magazine and a participant in her own monthly radio puzzle segment, That's Puzzling. Piya, game on and over to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to my office in Toronto. And if you think I'm mispronouncing the name of our city, I am not. Taylor Swift is here, right across the street. And so we are a bit overwhelmed by all the joy that is coming to us from just outside of our building. As Natalie mentioned, I do a game on my radio show Sunday mornings once a month. I'm happy to tell you that after losing 12 months in a row, I finally pulled out a W this past Sunday. So I'm ready to do all these things. I'm glad we're all here. I think all of us probably play games tied to media properties and talk to our friends about it. And also many of us are wondering, how do we do that? And how do we make that work with audience engagement and also a revenue strategy? So we'll get into all of that stuff. But first of all, if we can just begin, and we'll go Amy and then Jonathan and David. Let's just get a little bit about what your role in terms of game and gamification is. So Amy, why don't you go first? Tell me how you got into games and gamification at the Post.
Sure. Hi, first of all, it's great to be here and great to be with all of you. So I joined the Post a couple of years ago. I had been a sports editor before this, and I joined to kind of spearhead the creation of a daily news quiz for the Washington Post, which ended up being their first in-house game. And I write the Game Break newsletter for the Post, and we've since created a couple of other word games as well in addition. And I'm also a newsletter editor there at the same time. But my focus for games is continuing to write the daily news quiz and just work with the product team on different games.
Great, thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah, hey everyone. Also really excited to be here. I am the general manager and head of games for the New York Times. So I run what we call the games mission, and that is our daily puzzles across all the different surfaces and yeah, our objective is to be the premier destination for digital puzzles, and we've had an exciting few years, and glad to be here.
David.
Thank you. I'm very privileged to be a part of this conversation. So I'm David Clinch. I am from Ireland originally, came here to America to work for CNN, journalist for many years, and then a startup with Storyful. And then for the last couple of years, I have transformed into a media revenue consultant. And basically what that means is I talk to publishers of all sizes about what they need to maintain or create a sustainable revenue strategy. And then I go out and help them find the media technology to fulfill that. And games was always a part of that when I started a couple of years ago, and it has become an ever more increasingly important part of that conversation. Everybody wants to have the engagement that games bring. So I go out and I help them find solutions.
Okay, Jonathan, let me go back to you, because I think the gold standard, of course, when it comes to this right now is the New York Times. So can you just give us a sense of how many people are working under you in terms of the New York Times puzzling and gaming offerings, and like how big is that department?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to not give out exact numbers on that sort of thing. I mean, I've got roughly a dozen folks in the games editorial division. We, I think, have now 5 full-time puzzle editors and constructors, plus Will, plus Everdeen, who runs the group, and a number of folks working on community and our newsletters and our forums and things like that. So, you know, like a dozen on the editorial staff alone can kind of give you an idea. And then we have a big engineering team, product managers, product designers, producers, data analysts, marketers. So I'm very fortunate, and we're very fortunate to have the resources to mount a pretty significant games team. And yeah, and I'm sort of overseeing all of that.
And just in terms of setting the table, each day, how many people play the New York Times games?
Tens of millions, and is sort of the number that we give out. I mean, it changes as time goes on, and we have seasonality and whatnot. But that's our public number is tens of millions of people playing our games every week, and I would say even every day.
All right, Amy, I'm going to ask all 3 of you this, and Amy, let me start with you again. Just sort of big picture, like when you're thinking of games and you are on the front lines of making them, what is your general approach? Like what is the thing in your brain where you're like, we're trying to do X?
Yeah, I think for us, we're thinking a lot about a couple of things. Building habits. So what is going to bring people back on a regular basis? What's going to bring people back to the post, have them coming multiple times a week? And also, I think a sense of community. That's something that I think a lot about in the games that I create and in the newsletter that I write, is kind of forming a group of people. And this goes hand in hand with habit, I think, is you want to come back and then you want to feel like you're part of something. You want to feel like you're part of this games community. And I think that's a special thing about games, is it does kind of give that opportunity for readers to want to come back and do this thing with many other people that they know are doing the same. So those are some of the things we're thinking about.
And what about for you, Jonathan?
Very similar as to what Amy said. I mean, the power of games is the daily habit, and it's not by accident. There's a daily puzzle to solve, and it's the same puzzle that we're all trying to solve together. It's the same solution for the day, and then come back tomorrow for the next puzzle, and that kind of daily cadence of a little bit of joy in your life keeps you coming back daily when the news can be sort of lumpy, right? So that's kind of the power of that. I think for us, we have a couple of pillars, and one of those is time well spent. So I would say we're specifically not trying to get you to spend like 24/7 in our app. And again, that comes back to the tradition around the daily puzzle, you know, and particularly with something like Wordle, which, you know, you can do quite quickly, and you carve out that space for yourself. You solve Wordle, maybe you also do strands and connections, but we want that to be time that you choose, that fits into your life, and that you can kind of put it down once you've solved it and then come back the next day. So that's a little different than maybe the sort of typical free-to-play games industry at large. Like, we really don't even track, honestly, like sessions per day or time per session. We really want to create that daily habit, but not have you in like all the time. Yeah.
And David, when you help people, media companies, publishers, sort of think about how they, and we'll get into how that you think they should think about it, but like, what is your sort of banner thing that you say to them in terms of approach? How should media companies be thinking broadly about games?
Well, I think the number one thing I usually have to say is don't try to be the New York Times, with all obviously, awe and respect to what Jonathan and obviously what Amy and the Post team have built as well too. Any publisher that's approaching games thinking that they can end up where the Times or the Post is fooling themselves. But what I also usually say to anyone who says, should I do games? My response to them is usually, well, why do you want to do games, right? What is the purpose that you are trying to achieve? And that's a very product-focused approach that I take with any product that I might be talking to them about. You want a product because you heard somebody else is using it, or it's a buzzword or something else. The question is why? What are you trying to achieve, right? And if the answers are aligned with what both Amy and Jonathan said, I use the 3 R's: regularity, registration, and revenue, right? If those 3 R's are in the answer to that question, if somebody has thoughtfully approached games as being something that can help them achieve that, and obviously that's an oversimplification, but I'm trying to get them to focus in their answer on the purpose of the product that they're trying to achieve. And as long as they are trying to achieve those 3 things, then games fits very well into that kind of strategic approach. As both Amy and Jonathan said, you want regularity, and with regularity you get loyalty, right? You probably want registration because that's either subscriptions or donations or something else. And then all of that is revenue, but thoughtfully approached, right? The idea, if you just want revenue, you probably just want to get an off-the-shelf games thing that will just drive some advertising revenue for you. And honestly, just stop there. If that's it, if it's only about revenue. But usually there's a kind of a deeper approach that is about loyalty and regularity.
Okay, you'll probably just heard a big bang. It's because my phone fell off and I'm going to deal with that. But I think you can still all hear me. So I'll just continue on. And David, let me stay with you. And Jonathan's going to correct the record after you. But everyone thinks that games are like they are having a moment. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that moment. Like, why now? Why do you think people are craving them in terms of the consumer side or the reader side? But why also do you think that media companies, gaming's not new, so why were they like, yeah, that works, we should do that?
Well, I agree, gaming is not new, and we've heard many times that really what we're doing is just putting together the bundle again that used to exist in the newspaper years ago when comics and other things were there. So we're essentially just putting back what should never have been taken out, right? So if publishers approached news at whatever level they approached it as leading with articles and leading with news, well, great, but you're missing something, right? That was never really the full package. When I was at CNN, we used to always say that the Larry King show paid for the Baghdad bureau. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's always something that should pay for the news, that drives regularity, that keeps an audience that may not always want hard news all the time, right? So I do think that there's a kind of a recentering of the bundle. And then from a product point of view, the bundle is very appealing for a lot of publishers, especially maybe the larger ones who are looking at the success that the Times and News Corp and others have had with bundling various products together. If you were going to start a bundle, the most obvious kind of secondary product might be games, right? So I think that's a second answer. And then I think the third answer, which is why it's really important to have a good answer to why do you want to do games, right? Is that it's also a question of whether that audience that you bring will be part of your core audience, or whether you are going to sort of end up creating a games only audience that is only interested in games. So I think that the reason there's so much interest now is that while there was a little bit of a sort of a false start around the idea that just having a games audience was important and you needed to go out there and buy a games company or just start games for the sake of it, some of those companies that did that ended up realizing that they were creating some revenue, but creating a problem because it was a bifurcated audience, right? Yeah. And I think the new approach that I am centering on is games that can bring an audience that doesn't necessarily want news, but also adding gamification to a news audience, for a news audience, if they want that. If there is a portion of your audience, particularly maybe younger audience, that wants to access news via a quiz or a puzzle, you should be able to offer that product. And so I think the third answer is because technology is now enabling that. It's very hard work and it's expensive to do games. So if you're going to do them, you need to know why, and then also harnessing the power of technology to do it in a way that maybe wasn't possible before. So I think that's a long answer to why now.
Okay, and Jonathan, so tell us briefly about the history of the New York Times games. I think it started with the crossword puzzle a long time ago. So just, again, because I think some people like maybe thinking, oh, the New York Times has always had a crossword, but then it just, you know, got into these other things, sort of a happenstance. But just give us a bit of a history here.
Yeah, and I think David is exactly right, and it is strategic for us, and it has been strategic for some time. So the mission at the New York Times is to seek the truth and help people understand the world. The strategy, the business strategy that helps power the mission is to be the essential subscription for curious people seeking to engage with and understand the world. And that is the bundle, that essential subscription. And we sort of think of news as the sort of the sun of the solar system, and the planets revolving around it are the sub brands or the other aspects of the bundle, whether it's games, cooking, Wirecutter, The Athletic. And that has been the strategy for some time. And I'll it may be obvious, but the key insight that we have is that if a subscriber engages with both news and games on any given week, they're going to have the strongest long-term retention of any sort of like behavior pattern that we see inside the company and inside the bundle. So it really is that, kind of news plus games engagement. And there are other patterns that are very powerful as well, news and cooking and so forth. But that's kind of the why, right? Is because our strategy is the bundle, and we're growing subscriptions quite nicely with that strategy. And games, the role that it plays in the bundle is that to create that long-term subscriber retention and those daily habits. And this is not a reaction to anything recent, right? Like the first crossword puzzle ran in 1942, and it was quite deliberately started just a few weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Tough news cycle. Let's have a puzzle that feels like on brand, challenges your mind, but also is a distraction from the tough news of the day. And so we've been running, puzzles ever since then. And I will say it was controversial at the time. It took a memo all the way up to the publisher to convince the organization to run a puzzle. And we were certainly not the first paper to run a crossword puzzle by any means, but that was when the first New York Times puzzle ran. And I would say lastly, 1996, I believe, was when the website launched, newyorktimes.com. We had a digital crossword puzzle that same year, basically day and date with the news going online. The crossword went online, and it went online with a subscription, a separate subscription to the crossword that augmented the news experience. And then we launched an app in 2009, and then we started adding additional games. The Spelling Bee was sort of the next big hit digital game, and sort of showed the power of multiple games as opposed to just the crossword. I will say the Spelling Bee came out of the paper also and still runs in the paper as a variety puzzle. And then, of course, with the acquisition of Wordle in 2022, everything just got sort of like a sort of rocket fuel, and we've been up and to the right since then, and have now sort of a portfolio of games and in a way kind of a bundle within the bundle. But yeah, hopefully that's helpful. I also, like David, like when asked, I encourage people to not try to sort of copy what we've done, because you would really need to go back 80 years to the beginning and sort of build up. We have over 10,000 crossword puzzles in our archive. That's a big part of the subscriber value that we offer, and a big part of why people subscribe to games is that archive. And we have a similarly large one for the mini, and we have a growing archive of Wordle and connections puzzles. So yeah, we've been at it for a while, I guess, is sort of the takeaway.
And you talk about that bundling in terms of subscription, but you also at the Times, I can go play all these games without a subscription. So what's the thinking there?
So the kind of access model and the strategy for us is, and this isn't perfect and it's not the same across all puzzles, but generally speaking, we want a free daily puzzle that you can come and solve as an anonymous user. And that really helps us drive traffic and overall audience, and sort of the non-subscribed weekly active users is our convertible audience. That's our funnel. So the free daily puzzles drive that North Star for us, which is keeping the audience large. Then if you want us to remember you, stats, streaks, things like that, register for the free account. And now we have kind of a anonymous to registered state, and real Reggie value. Like now you can see your streaks and stats and other things, leaderboards, etc. And then if you want access to all of the content we have, all of the archives, that's subscriber only. And like there's some, Spelling Bee has a partial free and then it's paid for the full experience. The daily crossword is subscriber only from the start. There is no free daily crossword, but we do have a free trial of the crossword. So there's some historical reasons why we've got some tweaks in there per puzzle, but generally that's the access strategy.
Amy, why don't you talk a little bit about the post sort of strategy, subscription versus non-subscription, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about, because you are hands-on making these things, but can you just sort of give us an overview of the post side thinking on this?
Yeah, so I mean, when we started, obviously they're a little bit newer to original games. At least we had crosswords that existed already that we offered, and some games that weren't our own. And so a couple of years ago when I came on board, we obviously saw the crosswords do very, very well every single day. People love crosswords of all kinds. And so we decided to start with a daily news quiz that we kind of made on our own. And the thinking there, I think, was, we're the Washington Post. How do we kind of create a new game from the outset that still connects with our brand right off the bat as we get into this a little bit, right? So it was like a news quiz made sense. We're going to differentiate it by making it daily. We're going to add some different, designs to it to make it different than just other news quizzes that were out there. There's a wagering aspect. There's confetti, these different things that make it a little bit different, but seemed like a good entry point into, okay, we're going to start focusing on thinking about what games make sense for us and our brand, right? So we have that. And then we moved shortly after that, we made our own first word game called Keyword. And that's been a success as well. People love word games and coming to them. And we tend to see that with the Game Break newsletter, which I write, we kind of share both of those together and people like to play both. And then we have a third new game that's in beta mode right now. It's another word game. So I think the combination of experimenting with those different types of games, and we also, similar to what Jonathan was explaining, registration is kind of the games, you can play the games for free, but if you register for, say, Keyword, you can get access to all your stats and go back and play previous games. So that's kind of our thinking on it right now.
Who's your target audience?
I think that we obviously, like everybody, wants to reach newer audiences and get them to come back, but we're also really, what we've seen is kind of the habit of retention of subscribers that we have been bringing them back. But I think we do want to grow the audience and get people involved in new games. That's, I think, one of the things that we're trying with this game we have in beta mode is it's a little bit different than the other ones that we have. It's called Ridges, and I think we're interested in seeing kind of bringing some new audiences to that one.
I'll come back to you in just a sec, but David, hop in here again. People have a lot of questions for you. So when they say, well, like, hey, David, what do you think works better? Are they word games? Are they, I don't know, math challenges? What, again, are you sort of advising in that realm? Like, what are you seeing out there in the landscape?
Well, the second thing I say after I say don't try to be the New York Times and the Washington Post is, how can I help you be as like the New York Times and the Washington Post as you possibly can be in this area of games with the least possible resources? And when I say the least possible, some of the people I'm working with are literally the tiniest, smallest, most independent news organizations. And I'm sure there are people listening here going, good for Jonathan, good for Amy, they have these huge teams, I can never do that. Or even sort of hearing me talk about what you could do and still thinking, well, I don't have any time, any money, I can't do it. Well, that is no longer the case. And the answer to the question that I give is, okay, you want to do regularity, retention, revenue, you want to do that. I think the best way for you to do that is a weekly news quiz and a daily news word puzzle, right? And they say, great, how much does it cost? Almost nothing, right? Because AI can produce it for you. And how does it produce it for you? It produces it by taking words from your own journalism, right? So what do I, the small news organization, need to do? Do your journalism. Wake up every day, write your stories, put your stories up there, do what you're doing, right? And harness the power of very inexpensive technology. And I will stress, and I'm going to say it really loud, highly trained, very controlled technology, right? Not go out on the internet making stuff up, looking at the content that's on your website and creating a daily news word and a daily news quiz every day automatically. You then, perhaps even just for 5 minutes a day, go in as a human in the loop and check it, make sure it's okay, and it gets published every day, right? You now have something that has taken decades for the New York Times to build and buy and to create in a form that not only creates a similar, obviously much smaller, but similar level of regularity and registration that they have, and it costs you almost nothing, and the ROI is huge because it's connected to your core product, which is your news, right? Now, obviously, if I'm talking to a larger publisher that's maybe trying to compete for national audiences or international audiences with the Times and the Post, they would need to build a team. They would need to do a larger investment, right? And a mid-size, maybe you probably do have a team to do something more sophisticated. But for anyone who's smaller, I would say either just kind of half-arse it basically and just buy some off-the-shelf thing, and you'll get some juice basically from advertising. But that audience is not going to come to your core news, probably. They'll just play those off-the-shelf games. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with those, right? That's great if that's what you want to do. But if you are going to invest in this at all, in my view, if you're smaller, and especially if you're very small, harnessing the power of technology to basically do all of the work for you, and then just make sure it's okay with the human in the loop, and then you can get the ROI based on, oh, the word connects to an article that's about a city tour of Boston, right? Or the word connects to an article that's about a sponsored post that somebody paid me $500 for, right? And I'm only paying $50 a month for the quiz. I've got a 10 by ROI with one question. Do you see what I mean? So if I'm helping a small news organization think about games and puzzles, I'm trying to go right to the last R, which is revenue. Like, just basically don't bother doing it unless it is going to generate significant ROI for you with registration and revenue. Because honestly, it's just too much work to put products in place and to think strategically if you have next to no resources. So I think the opportunity that has presented now is that technology can enable the kind of juiciest, highest ROI part of what the Times and the Post have built is now available to small and even tiny micro news organizations. And I will also just say, to recognize this as well too, the New York Times has been very generous because they also are wanting to support local news, not necessarily, with a product themselves, but to acknowledge that a tiny news organization should be able to have a news word or a news quiz, right? And not be worried that the New York Times is going to take it down or anything. And they have been very understanding and generous that is part of what should support the local news ecosystem. So I think that's another important thing to recognize, is that the big players, the Post, the New York Times and others, are also very supportive of smaller news organizations adding games and things like that. Because, yes, the New York Times and the Post want to get their audience, but they don't want to destroy the news ecosystem by just everyone playing games and consuming the New York Times every day. I think it's also a really interesting opportunity for a kind of a democratization of this kind of engagement with news, which is important for society, right? Not just the news industry. So I would just say, when I am helping news organizations think about this, I think revenue first, right? And resources, just the least possible resources. And then just really think about how that connects to your core news. If you're doing your journalism, games should support that, right? Not take away from it.
Let me pick up on something that you mentioned there, which is AI. And there will be lots of journalists watching this who are just trying to get a job or keep their jobs because the media is downsizing so much. And they hear the words, oh, well, AI can make these things. So make that connection between, the question today is, will games save journalism? Will it? But if we outsource it all to AI, people are like, it's not great for us humans.
Don't forget I said, right? the games only work if they connect to an article. Somebody has to write that article. The journalism has to be done. So I'm starting from a position with anything I'm doing with publishers to say, you have to be doing journalism, right? I'm not going to bring technology to you that's going to replace your journalism. So I think that's very important to remember. AI can create a quiz from journalism, original journalism that has been done, but it's not replacing somebody's job. In fact, it's supporting their job.
Amy, let's talk about, you come to work every day like many of us do, and you got to write a news quiz. So can we just get a little bit granular, starting with, you get up in the morning and what do you do? Like, do you read the newspaper? How do you sort of go about your day?
Yeah, so I'm basically monitoring, because it's daily, and then there's a weekend version on Friday that is 10 questions plus a bonus question, kind of trying to log ideas all week. So, wake up, just kind of tune into news meetings, read around the site, and try to keep track of what questions would be good to use. The way the quiz is based is it's around a quote. So the article needs to have a quote in it. It needs to be something that is easy enough that people would have a chance of getting it right, but not so easy that they'll be like, this is, not even worth my time. That, that balance you're kind of trying to figure out, and a balance of topics, so that, it's hard these days, especially, to not have every single question be about politics every single day, but you want it to be about different things, right? I think that's one of the points, especially with this news quiz, is the game that we have, that it does both. It is about the news and about our journalism, but it's also supposed to be fun. And so you want to make sure that you can get that balance of topics in there. So I'm kind of monitoring throughout the week, writing questions as I can, as I see it, trying to get ahead when I can. It kind of goes with the news cycle. When there's a lot of news, I can get it done, a couple days in advance. If it's a slower news week, you're just kind of trying to write questions throughout the day. So and it's also interesting, just to go back to what you mentioned before and what David was talking about with AI, is, as someone who's writing the questions, it's something that I'm thinking about in terms of, like, is there a way that I could use that technology to help me in my work, but in a way where I would still be, there are still humans involved. And I think that's an important thing to toggle, is, using it to maybe take away some of the things that I'm doing on a daily basis, but still have, like, that human element is still very important. So just wanted to add.
So you said one of the balances that you have to strike is this too hard? Is this too easy? We struggle with this all the time. We run the questions around with some people in the office, and I'm like, someone will say, it's really hard. Someone says it's really easy this month. So how do you sort of think about that? Because there's people out there who are listening again and watching, are going to have to do these for their organizations.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're able to see a percentage of, how many people got it right on the first try, or with the hint, or in the multiple choice, or just got it wrong entirely. So I have kind of a feeling of topics that tend to trip people up. Sports, not a favorite topic of many people. It seems to always be one that I get complaints about. But you just, after you do it enough times, you kind of get a feel for, all right, maybe I could add an extra sentence in the main question here that might give a context clue to make it a little more achievable. They might, they still might not get it, but it will at least feel like they have a chance. And I think that's also something, when we launched this, that was important to me, was that it felt like I didn't want people to ever feel stupid or like frustrated that they didn't know enough, or that they weren't reading the news enough. I wanted to feel like you have a shot at getting this. If you can't get it, you have a hint, and then you learned something. If you didn't know it, you learned something new. That was important to me too.
Yeah. Jonathan, why don't you come in here on this question of, sort of people learning something? Because I think, to Amy's point, people don't want to feel like, oh, the games are too hard for me because my life is too hard for me, So can you just pick up on that, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, what we see in the data, and it can differ from puzzle to puzzle, which is why we do think of, like, our portfolio of games together. But the key insight is that solve rates correlate to return rates, and people want to solve things, and they want that kind of rush of, I got it right, I figured it out. And that makes them want to come back the next day and do it. So it sounds simple. Obviously, some of our puzzles are harder than others. Within the crossword, we have a long tradition of starting easy on a Monday and getting more difficult throughout the week. I personally have a max streak of 4 on the New York Times crossword puzzle because I cannot do a Friday. And we probably should do a better job of even explaining how that works to people. So the crossword tends to be sort of the hardcore of what we do. Now, we've done some cool things recently. We have an easy mode for Friday. It's a newsletter. It's pretty cool. It goes out and for subscribers, obviously, and you can get the same crossword puzzle through the newsletter, but all the clues are a little easier. So it's just a fun way to kind of still do a Friday. You know, as we look at things like connections, Wordle, strands, we see different solve rates. Wordle has the highest solve rate, and it's one of the reasons that it's so popular and it's our biggest game. And, you know, we see that connections has a variable solve rate. There's days when connections, everybody's getting it, and there's other days when a lot of people don't get it. And that became sort of the meme of connections, and it really helped kind of power its, you know, what was like an incredible sort of viral explosion, particularly in the first quarter of this year. And so we embrace that. You know, we're not behind the scenes trying to say, you know, connections must have a 78% solve rate or higher every day. We're sort of recognizing that that's what makes connections special. But on the whole, we think we've got a balanced portfolio, and, you know, Wordle is kind of the crown jewel. And yeah, people, they like to solve things. They want to feel smart. And game teams often have a tendency to want to make things too tricky, and that's not what it's about. It's about making users feel good.
David, do you have
Yeah.
anything to add to this particular part of the conversation we're having?
No, I agree completely. I think you want the Goldilocks mix, right? Not too hard, not too easy. And I think that relates to another thing, which I think both Amy and Jonathan have hinted at, which is the marketing of these games, right? If you're the New York Times and the Post, you have a huge audience coming, and you can do marketing organically through to that, you know, large existing audience. If you're a smaller news organization and you add a quiz or a daily word game, you don't want to scare somebody off by the first time they do it, it being so impenetrable that they just will never try it again, right? So the first job of marketing is to make it engaging and solvable and doable, and you want to return, right? The second job of marketing is probably making it really easy to get a reminder of when the next day's or the next week's puzzle or quiz is available. So text or email or something to remind you. And then just, I mean, I know I'm kind of taking it a slightly different direction, but this is really important for anyone who's going to do games. I will tell you, you cannot do it and expect it to work unless you market it well, right? Unless you have a strategy. And again, the luxury of the Times is being able to kind of lean into memes that are already scaled, because the Times is the Times. You know, it's going to be a long time before there's a meme about your game, right? You have to find ways to market it based on what your audience is interested in, or, you know, monitor comments or monitor email responses, or, you know, if there's a functionality request like streaks or other things, you have to be able to respond to those things very quickly. And then also just tie it to very specific regular marketing. It should be on top of your newsletter every day. Here's today's, you know, daily word game. You know, the weekly quiz should be connected to an email that has the week's news in it, you know, so there's an organic connection between the news people are consuming in the newsletter and the puzzle or the quiz that you're giving them. Marketing is an undervalued skill for all of news, right? And I think that if somebody comes into games and thinks that games is the marketing in and of itself, they're fooling themselves. It can ultimately be that once you have a really engaged games audience, it can function as marketing for your news, but it doesn't do that at the start, right? You have to actually market the game. And like the games I work with, at the end of the game, it says, read the article that the word came from, right? And somebody clicks through and they go through to the article. That's great. That's circular marketing, but you have to work at it. You really do. So AI can't replace journalism, and AI definitely can't replace marketing, right? So you definitely need ninjas on your team if you're a small or mid-sized news organization. Yes, the technology enables now the quizzes and the word games. That's the start, right? But it doesn't automatically connect you to an audience, right? You have to make sure that the audience knows that this quiz is there, that they know how to get it every day, that they're rewarded. Amy was talking about, you know, graphics and other things that show people that they've done well or how they've competed with others. You have to make it easy to share with family and friends. all of those things are possible, but that is an essential part of the strategy of games. If you just add them and they sit there, they will either die or they will just kind of create a monolithic kind of games audience that never does anything else. So marketing it and rewarding the audience for engaging, I think, are incredibly important parts.
Okay, we just have a few minutes left before we'll go to audience questions. And Amy, I want to ask you, and I'll come to Jonathan after that. I'm sure you get a lot of people every day who tell you, even when they're wrong, that you got it wrong, or that there was another option, or all those kinds of things that we see in journalism, asking for corrections and that transparency piece. We know that trust in journalism is on the decline. And so I'm just wondering, how do you approach that and what you do, that sort of transparency piece, when you get it wrong, corrections, how do you do that?
Yeah, so first of all, I do read the inbox and I like to respond to people when they email me about that. I found that when somebody is angry about something on a game or on a quiz, the best thing you could do is email them back and just like show that you're a human, and then they will email you and be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're responding, So I think that kind of just like human connection, again, that sense of community, I think is important. And then, yeah, I think owning up to it when you do get it wrong. So in the newsletter that I write, sometimes I have this section called Taking the L, which is when I've gotten things wrong, I will address them in the newsletter. I think that's kind of a more fun way of doing it. When there is a correction to be made, we have added them to the quiz itself, and just said like correction if there was a factual error within the question. In the newsletter is when we'll kind of discuss whether an answer wasn't acceptable that some people thought should have been acceptable, or those kinds of discrepancies and debates. So I think just being honest, showing you're a human, being upfront with people, people tend to respond positively to that.
Jonathan, you want to talk about that piece too, the transparency, the corrections?
Yeah, I really agree with all of that and everything Amy said. And so kind of just plus one and ditto to that. I'm very, very fortunate that we have an awesome community management team. I'm able to have, a dedicated function. And then of course we've got a really great customer care team. And, aside from all of the standards around corrections, and of course it's, trust is at the core of what we do. So we follow pretty rigorous standards around all of that, but we just are fortunate and really prioritize the rigor that goes behind, the puzzles that go out every day. Like, I could talk for a whole hour. I'm so proud of the team and the operation that we have, and it is very well resourced. But between fact checkers, between testing panels, the way we rotate those testing panels, the diversity of our constructors and our testers in terms of just getting a wide variety of eyes on what's going out the door before it goes out the door. We hope to, our goal is to not be in a position where we have to correct something, and we put a tremendous amount of effort into that. But yes, also a very engaged community, answering emails, being out on the forums to respond and to create, to engage in conversations with our very, very active community. And it does vary from game to game. Spelling Bee is like the one that is particularly vocal and fun to work with, because our editor Sam Mazursky sort of chooses every day what words will be valid in the Spelling Bee for that day. And sometimes he makes judgment calls that create a lot of conversation online, and we call that the hive mind, and they're very vocal. So the Spelling Bee forum it's a big part of what we do. I will say from a business perspective, we actually generate pretty substantial amount of advertising revenue off of the forums. And so community is not just something that we think is good for the games, which it is. It's also kind of good for the business in its own way. So yeah, big arm of our operation is focused on all of that.
Okay, I just want to have one quick last go around before we turn to audience questions. And I'm just going to bounce off the title of the session, Will Games Save Journalism? It's a lofty question, but I just want each of you to kind of give a closing remark on that. Amy, why don't I start with you again?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can say that it can be the only thing that saves it, but I think it's an important part of journalism going forward to have a diverse portfolio of offerings for news organizations to have different things that they can go to. And I think this is what we've seen the Times do so well, is you can go to it for so many different things, right? And I think that games, being one of them, is important, and we've seen the success of that.
Jonathan, will games save journalism?
I think the way we talk about it is that the strategy is working. It's again, it's not a reaction. It's not a Hail Mary. It's the strategy working, and yeah, that's how we see it.
David.
I'm going to go with a yes. Yes, games is and will be an essential part of the combination of technology and strategy that saves journalism. I'm convinced of it, because I think it's all about engagement. If nobody's reading your journalism, why are you doing it? If you don't include games and gamification in your approach to your journalism, you are probably missing huge chunks of potential addressable audience, and you're certainly missing just a great product and a great tool to drive the 3 R's, right? Regularity, registration, and revenue. So I would just say I am 100% convinced that games are an essential part of the solution for saving journalism in the long run.
Okay, we have some questions in about 10, 12 minutes to get through them. Some of them we've sort of talked about, so I'll try and I just have them in front of me, so sorry for looking off camera, but let me begin with this one. This comes from William, and he asked, and I think we've talked about this first part, so maybe we focus on the second part. But William asked, how can game departments work with editorial to create interactive products that pull from newsrooms coverage? If you have experience with this, what are some of the lessons you've learned, best practices? So Amy, why don't we start with that second part of that question? Sort of the lessons you've been learning about drawing from the newsroom's content and that interaction.
Yeah. So I'm kind of the editorial person on games here, and I think when you're pulling from journalism, there's a whole other decision factor that comes into it, which is for the quiz, for example, you have to keep content in mind, right? And what might clash with the style of the game. So if there's confetti, you might not want an extremely serious topic to clash with that confetti, right? So you're thinking about all of these things, similar to how you're thinking about approaching journalism in general and writing stories. But it's, we want to make sure that that it makes sense. What you're pulling from fits in with what we're putting out there in the game form. So that's one thing I've learned, is just, trying to get variety, balance, and still making sure that there's not a kind of strange reaction of whoa, like this question and then confetti, so those are all things that I've learned to kind of think about more.
Right. Jonathan and David, you want to hop in there?
I mean, for us, it's a little different maybe than the way Amy's group is set up. So we do have a news quiz and a couple of quizzes, and they sit quite squarely in the newsroom and are not actually part of games. So we kind of create that distinction between a quiz that's tied to news content. And what we do on games is quite deliberately and specifically not related to the news. Like that's just sort of our goal.
Why is that? Like that was a deliberate choice, obviously, of the Times.
Yeah, it's a diversion from the news. It should be a distraction from the news, and we should never be the news. And we work surprisingly hard at that, and thinking about just even what the Wordle of the day, if that word that goes out the door, feels newsy, or even if it wasn't intended to be, that's something that we work really hard to avoid. Yeah, so we want to bring joy to people. We want to be a diversion from the news, and yeah, that's how we approach it. But we do have very interesting sort of news adjacent content and quizzes coming out of the newsroom that that is very engaging, particularly for subscribers.
Okay, so Julie noted Trump will never be the Wordle answer because that would be tied to the news. You can use Trump in many ways.
Yeah, not touching that one.
Yeah,
David, go ahead.
Well, I think, again, that's an important distinction that the Times makes. But having said that, I think it's also important to understand that they do have news games and quizzes that are in editorial. And I think that, the way I would think about it is every news organization I work with, even the tiniest one, even the one that doesn't have the resources to build a quiz or to, create a quiz themselves, but maybe has the 5 minutes to check it to make sure that it's okay before it goes out. The person who's doing that every newsroom should have an Amy, right? Every newsroom should have a ninja, somebody who's totally engaged in not just the product that is a game, but also in the editorial mission of the news organization and supporting that, right? You shouldn't hire somebody who, if you're a tiny news organization, who's just good at creating games, right? You should hire somebody who's an engagement person, who knows how to market news, who knows how to get young audiences, right? So when I said games as part of the future of rescuing news, that's what I mean, right? You should have somebody on your staff, even if it's you, the publisher or the editor-in-chief or whoever it is, right? You should have somebody on your staff that understands the role of this kind of engagement in marketing and engaging people with your core product, right? So I deal with news organizations that want quizzes and word games that are connected to their journalism. So that's a good start, right? But not every day does that word have to be hard news or death and destruction, right? It can be fun, it can be real estate, it can be entertainment, and you can get a real estate agent to pay for the question, right? To drive it to branded content. You can do whatever you want with it, right? Because your purpose in doing the games is to get an engaged audience that will come to your website and consume your whole product, right? And I think that that is a very important aspect of the answer to that question, is that if you have somebody who is in any way connected to games on your staff, they should be thinking about it as how it plays a part in engaging people with your overall product. And that's a ninja, basically.
Let me stay with you, David. This question comes from Craig, who asks, how would you recommend a news organization test the waters with gaming in a low resource way, or does it have to be an all-in endeavor?
Again, I think the answer is I don't want to get into like particular brands here because I don't want to be too salesy here, but there are plenty of, and you can ask me separately if you want to, or you can go out and look at the things that I'm connected to. There are plenty of options now to either test games in a kind of an off-the-shelf, you can go and buy some revenue share products that just kind of sit adjacent to your news and drive games, usually kind of traditional type games. You can buy a relatively inexpensive or even a revenue share model for that, right? And again, I have no objection to that at all. I think that works for some publishers. But my personal suggestion would be that you look at one of the solutions that does offer an AI-powered ability to just create a daily news word or a daily news or a weekly news quiz at a very, very low cost for you, and test it, right? And maybe if you have more than one market, you just test it in one market and then bring it to others, or you test it in one vertical before you do it everywhere. So I think there are very inexpensive options that are available to a publisher of any size to do either an off-the-shelf revenue share model if you just want to kind of juice your advertising revenue, or to test one of these AI-powered products that is connected to your news core. So it is relatively easy and very inexpensive to test. And I personally have never dealt with a small publisher who started doing this that has stopped doing it, because it becomes addictive. And if you have 5 by 10 by ROI, even if that's only a few $100s, right? That's meaningful for a tiny news organization. So once news organizations get to see the juice that this brings, it's usually kind of a question of how much can they do? Like, how many different quizzes can they have? So I also sometimes have to tell people to calm down and not do too many quizzes or quizify everything. But usually the answer is there are pretty easy, inexpensive options that you can start and test with.
Okay, Amy, I'm going to throw this one your way, but I think you can answer this one. This is from Matt. Can you talk about how games more complex than crosswords and Wordle can be used to increase news consumption? The Washington Post has done games where you play as a rat navigating trash-filled streets to discuss the city's rat problem. Politico has created a You Be the Campaign Manager game to help people understand the election. And you're thinking, where do games like this fit? And maybe I'll ask Amy, and then Dave or Jonathan, if you want to pop in here, that's great too.
Yeah, so we've had discussions about kind of more complex games in terms of like storytelling games or things where you are, completing things over a period of time. But I think just resource-wise, it's just a lot more time consuming, right? Because it's something you're building out kind of a world, and there's just a lot more that goes into that. So I think it's something we're certainly thinking about. It's something I've thought about. I like to brainstorm ideas of. I just think the execution of that is a bit harder. It's a longer path in terms of making that a reality, but it's something that I've thought a lot about.
Jonathan, is that something that you think and talk about at the Times?
All the time. We have a big effort to sort of come up with the next game always running. And the thing about games, and I come from games industry, so my whole career has been in computer and video games. And it's a $300 billion global industry. All games are possible on the planet. And what people love about games when they work in them and sort of get sort of like excited about being part of it is that anything is possible. And it's also the double-edged sword of, how do you figure out how to focus when that's the thing that's so exciting about interactive entertainment, is that it can be anything, and it's changing and evolving all the time. And there's, dozens of categories and genres that you could explore. So you really do need to, kind of bring things back all the time to what are we trying to do? Who's our audience? What is our competitive advantage? What is our area of expertise? And continue to innovate within that and get better and better and try to sort of eke out leadership there. So yeah, but we have all of the ideas that you can possibly imagine on a spreadsheet, and we have to be very choosy about what we pursue.
David, this comes from Peter for you. I'm interested in hearing specific revenue models that are being tried by news outlets, both big and small, for these programs, meaning games and gamification.
Yeah. So again, without naming names, people can reach out to me if they want more specifics. There are revenue models where a daily news word, either every day of the week or a couple of days of the week, the word is sponsored by someone, right? So the publisher is paying either a tiny amount or a revenue share to do the daily word every day. And once, twice, or even 7 days a week, they're selling the sponsorship of that word, right? So that's probably automatically paying for itself, if not generating even higher. In the news quiz, you maybe got 6 questions, and one of those questions every week is sponsored by a local business or somebody else. That's probably paying for your entire month of the product, right? With that one thing. And by the way, just to be clear, the advertisers love it, right? Because it's high engagement time, super visibility for their brand or for their advertising, and in some cases, literally a direct link to their branded or sponsored content, right? So those are kind of high level ones. Advertising in and of itself, where I'm very big and bullish, as I think the New York Times and the Post are, on attention time management as being the future of advertising. And games and gamification play a huge role there, because contextually and with attention time metrics, an advertiser getting a guaranteed human eyeball for a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes playing a game is worth a huge CPM boost over a regular click or impression. So that's another model that is really emerging, is connecting gamification in games to attention time management. And then I would just say the long tail, which is a very important one, is donations, registration, and all of those things for local NPR station, a local nonprofit, or anybody. If you've got a games audience that just loves your game, and at the end of the game, a little window pops up, says, donate $5, you're probably going to get much more revenue from that than you are with just the audience that's kind of churning through your regular news. We have seen significant boost in donations and memberships and other kinds of subscription model reader revenue models based on games, because people are in the mindset of loyalty and happiness and liking you as a brand. They tend to give more. And you can also connect a game to a particular strategic, monthly fundraising or annual fundraising. A lot of publishers we work with do that. So I would say there are 3, 4, 5 different models that work. But again, you kind of have to do it, right? You cannot expect the game to just do everything by itself. The game will bring the audience. What you do with it in terms of those advertising or revenue models is on you as a publisher, no matter what size you are.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Jonathan and David and Amy, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time. And to everyone watching, thank you for joining us on behalf of the CJF, and thank you for me as well. Have a good day.